there are three types of adjectives in German: attributive, predicative, and adverbial. Attributive adjectives come before a noun and always take an ending to match a noun in gender, number, and case. Predicative adjectives describe a noun, but they appear after a linking verb, staying in their base form with no change. Adverbial adjectives function as adverbs, and they describe how an action is performed without changing and staying in their base form. In this video, I'll explain every type of German adjective. Let's begin with attributive adjectives. Attributive adjectives come before a German noun, like der große Hund, but in the language, they're the most difficult because of how many endings they take under a case, number, and gender. To understand attributive adjectives, we must look at the three types of declensions that an adjective can have. Such adjectives can be modified depending on the presence and type of article. Because German has many endings for attributive adjectives, we need to analyze every type of declension they have. Considering how much information needs to be known, it's best to practice attributive adjectives every day when speaking German because it is not something that you can remember instantly. My recommendation is to practice speaking attributive adjectives daily until you understand how to use them properly in every situation. The first declension for attributive adjectives is the strong declension that has no article at all, meaning that it's used when no article precedes an adjective. An adjective in the strong declension takes strong endings, which are similar to the endings of definite articles, although they're not exact. To understand which strong endings match which article, we look at this chart. In the nominative, a masculine adjective ends in er. A feminine adjective ends in e. A neuter adjective ends in s, and a plural adjective ends in e. As I said, strong endings are somewhat similar to the endings of definite articles. In the accusative, the endings are borrowed from the nominative, but the only change is that a masculine adjective ends in n. In the dative, the endings are similar to definite articles. Masculine ends in m, feminine ends in r, neuter ends in m, and plural ends in n. In the genitive, masculine ends in n, feminine ends in r, neuter ends in n, and plural ends in r. These are the strong endings in the strong declension for attributive adjectives, and they work with no article at all. To fully see how these endings apply to adjectives in context, let's have sentences with strong declensions in every case, gender, and number. Some of these will not be logical, but again, we're focusing on the use of attributive adjectives with strong declension. Nominative phrases can be guter Wein, kalte Milch, frisches Brot, rote Äpfel. In the following sentences, I'm using a different adjective for every gender, so you can see that the endings perfectly match, coming before the noun. Accusative phrases can be Ich trinke guten Wein. Ich kaufe kalte Milch. Isst frisches Brot. Mag rote Äpfel. In this case, the endings are borrowed with the only change in the masculine guten. Dative phrases can be Ich helfe mit gutem Wein. Kocht mit kalter Milch. Sie isst mit frischem Brot. Spricht mit roten Äpfeln. The last two make no sense, but again, we're focusing on the adjectives. Genitive phrases can be Der Geschmack guten Weins. Der Geruch kalter Milch. Die Kruste frischen Brotes. Die Farbe roter Äpfel. This is how strong declensions work for attributive adjectives in every case, gender, and number. Now, let's see the second type of declension. The second declension for attributive adjectives is the weak declension that strictly works with definite articles. An adjective in the weak declension takes weak endings when used with definite articles in any case. The reason why this declension is weak is because it only uses two endings that are borrowed in almost every gender and case, as you can see in the chart. When used with a definite article, adjectives in the nominative end in e, except the plural, which ends in. Adjectives in the accusative will also end in e, except the masculine and plural, which end in. The rest all end in n, which is why they're weak endings in the weak declension, so they're not too difficult to remember. Because adjectives in the weak declension only work with definite articles, we have to understand them in context. To make learning simple, I will use the same examples as before, only this time there is a definite article in every case. Nominative phrases are der gute Wein, die kalte Milch, das frische Brot, die roten Äpfel. The endings perfectly match. Accusative phrases are ich trinke den guten Wein, ich kaufe die kalte Milch, isst das frische Brot, mag die roten Äpfel. Dative phrases are ich helfe mit dem guten Wein, kocht mit der kalten Milch, sie isst mit dem frischen Brot, spricht mit den roten Äpfeln. Once again, the last two don't really make sense. Genitive phrases are der Geschmack des guten Weins, der Geruch der kalten Milch, die Kruste des frischen Brotes, die Farbe der roten Äpfel. This is how weak declensions work for attributive adjectives in every case, gender, and number. Now, let's see the last type of declension. The last declension for attributive adjectives is the mixed declension, which only works with indefinite articles. An adjective in the mixed declension takes mixed endings when used with indefinite articles in any case. This declension is mixed because it borrows and mixes endings from previous declensions. In this declension, you'll find that the majority of endings are weak, while the rest are strong. It's mixed because the declension mixes endings from previous declensions. In this sense, we don't need to cover the endings because we know them from previous declensions. But the significant change is that the mixed declension only works with indefinite articles. As a side note, indefinite articles cannot be plural because they're only used for singular nouns. So, it's possible to use their negative versions, but in context, I'll use possessive adjectives like my for the plural mixed declension. To make learning simple, let's reuse the same examples but with indefinite articles. In this manner, a lot of phrases will not make sense, but again, we're focusing on adjective endings. Nominative phrases are ein guter Wein, eine kalte Milch, ein frisches Brot, meine roten Äpfel. Accusative phrases are ich trinke einen guten Wein, ich kaufe eine kalte Milch, isst ein frisches Brot, mag meine roten Äpfel. Dative phrases are ich helfe mit einem guten Wein, kocht mit einer kalten Milch, sie isst mit einem frischen Brot, spricht mit meinen roten Äpfeln. Genitive phrases are der Geschmack eines guten Weins, der Geruch einer kalten Milch, die Kruste eines frischen Brotes, die Farbe meiner roten Äpfel. Despite many sentences not making sense, this is how mixed declensions work for attributive adjectives in every case, gender, and number. Overall, this is how attributive adjectives fully work in German. They come before nouns and are determined by the presence and type of article, the case, and the gender and number of a noun. Nouns without any article take the strong declension. Nouns with definite articles take the weak declension. Nouns with indefinite articles take the mixed declension. Gender can also help determine strong endings by looking at definite article endings, while dative and genitive articles often end in n. The concept even applies when there are multiple adjectives in a phrase, so attributive adjectives are not as bad as they seem. Now, let's discuss predicative adjectives. German predicative adjectives are based on predicates and describe a noun by appearing after a linking verb, which doesn't show an action, but rather connects the subject to a description, explaining what something is. Predicative adjectives are easier to understand because they do not take endings, they don't modify nouns directly, and they stay in their base form and are not affected by any case, gender, or number. In context, a predicative adjective describes a noun by not directly modifying it and coming after a linking verb. Some German linking verbs are sein, bleiben, werden, scheinen, aussehen, klingen, riechen, fühlen, and more. Some examples are: Das Wetter ist kalt. Bleibt ruhig. Sie wird müde. Das Essen riecht lecker. Das klingt gut. When it comes to predicative adjectives, a key rule is that they do not have endings, which means they never get modified and stay in their dictionary form. In contrast, we can compare them with attributive adjectives. Notice how the attributives come before nouns, and their endings change to match the case, gender, and number. On the other hand, the predicatives come after linking verbs, with no endings or changes. Common phrases with predicative adjectives are: Mir ist kalt. Es ist mir egal. Ihm war schlecht. Das ist mir wichtig. Das ist schwer. Das klingt interessant. Overall, this is how predicative adjectives work in German. Now, let's finish with adverbial adjectives. German adverbial adjectives function as adverbs when describing how an action is performed. Similarly, they do not have endings and stay in their base form. However, they can modify verbs, adjectives, and whole sentences, often following a verb or coming before an adjective. Unlike in English, where adjectives and adverbs have different forms, like adding ly, German uses the same word for both. We can look at this concept by comparing attributives to adverbials. Notice how the attributives have an ending to match the case, gender, and number, but the adverbials have no ending and modify verbs instead by using the same form, which is contrary in English. For instance, we can say, Sie spricht ruhig. She speaks calmly. We know it's adverbial because it describes a verb, and because English uses ly in the adverb. However, if we say, Sie ist ruhig, she is calm, now we have a predicative that has the same form as the adverbial, but in English, the ending ly is dropped, and the form changes. It's important to understand that an adverbial adjective can describe a verb, another adjective, or a whole sentence, and when it does so, there is no ending or change. While some adjectives will change their meaning, in special cases, others might have a slightly different ending, like the adjective gern. Gern means liked as a predicative, but it changes to gerne as an adverbial, which also changes the meaning to gladly or willingly. Some examples of adverbial adjectives modifying other adjectives are: Der Film war unglaublich spannend. Ist sehr nett. Sie fährt erstaunlich schnell. Finally, it's important to discuss the position of adverbials in a sentence. Because they always stay in their base form, they generally follow the standard German adverb placement. 1. It can go after a verb. Sie läuft schnell. 2. It can go before an adjective. Das war unglaublich schwierig. And 3. It can go to the beginning or end of a sentence when modifying a whole sentence. Langsam wird es kalt. Wird es kalt, langsam. Overall, this is how adverbial adjectives work in German. They don't change or have endings, and they modify verbs, adjectives, and whole sentences.